Plato predicted that democracies produce tyrants who turn from man to wolf. Tad DeLay is back on the podcast, explaining why that ancient diagnosis feels eerily prescient in 2025, and what the revolutions of 1848 can teach us about our current crisis. We live in a culture that prioritizes lying at every level, from social media influencers to politicians covering up genocide, violence, and coercion. And in our conversation, Tad makes the case for bringing back shame, and it's not what you think. The line that he traces from Plato's Republic to the crises that are currently taking place around the world, from the French Revolution to the problematic Peter Thiel. He asks the question, how did we get here? How did we get to a place where both parties have no shame about lying to protect pedophiles or enable genocide? I'm just saying, this is a doozy. And the questions were inspired by people who watched Tad's lecture as part of our Democracy in Tension Summit. And if you'd like to check out that lecture or all the others that come along with it, you can head over to the link right in this episode description. But I am so thrilled to have my buddy Tad back on the podcast, an amazing philosopher, an expert in climate change and psychoanalysis. And we talk about that and more. So, here we go. Buckle your philosophical safety belts. And remember, friends, the best brew is a shared brew. So clicky, the sherry, and tell somebody. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, returning to the podcast to answer some questions people sent in after his lecture, a part of the online summit on democracy and tension. Is Tad DeLay, who's now got a new position in Lansing teaching philosophy. And we're going to have some fun, Tad, because believe it or not, your lecture is a bit provocative. Could you anticipate it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was my hope, and it's wonderful to be back and talking to you. It was really wonderful to get the invitation to talk about this stuff. This kind of been leading out of my last book, on climate change and political philosophy, and then like the last 2 years with the onslaught in Gaza, I've just been trying to learn everything that I can to kind of plug some holes in my understanding of Christian apocalypticism, think about Zionism, Arab revolutions, of which I didn't know nearly as much as I should. And so it was really wonderful to get an opportunity to try to tie some of this together in a coherent narrative. So hopefully I did that.
Yeah. Well, we got a bunch of questions, and I know everyone listening won't have heard the lecture, which, if you want to listen to that lecture, along with a bunch of others, you should click the link in the post for this, and then you can access all the videos in the summit. One of the places I think would be fun to start is your lecture kind of moved like a funnel, right? From the question of democracy as philosophers have wrestled with it, engaging Plato and Aristotle, all the way down to the different powers that are at play in our contemporary moment. And so here's one of the questions. Why start with Plato's critique of democracy leading to tyranny? Are you suggesting that living through Socrates' prediction about demagogues promising prosperity and the erasure of debts?
The short answer is that I spend a lot of time thinking about Plato's Republic because I teach through the whole book as part of the first half of my intro philosophy classes. I structure my classes as kind of a combination between this one great book and the rest of it that's kind of a survey. And so I spend a lot of time walking students through these. And of course, just so much of it feels eerily prescient, right? There's the Greeks, for whatever reason, just had us pegged on the problem of democracy, which is that, as the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari later put it, the fundamental problem of political philosophy is, why do people desire their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? How do people possibly reach the point of shouting more taxes, less bread? Why do people want humiliation and enslavement not only for others but for themselves? And this is something that you see already in Plato's Republic, where when he talks about the imperfect societies, the perfect being this perfectly hierarchical society where everyone's doing their duty, led by philosopher kings and guardians. How do you get from that to like imperfect societies like democracies and tyrannies? And of course, when he's talking about tyranny, he's basically still just talking about democracy, right? He he takes for granted that whatever we think of as tyranny occurs within a democracy, and you just kind of like you look around someday, and before you know it, the leader has changed from man to wolf and begun to devour everyone. And so I think it's a helpful place just because it is a persistent problem located within democracies. And if you are to read what Plato has to say about it, you will feel like he's talking about 2025. So, yeah, so I mean, that's more or less the reason of where I kind of came from with that question.
Maybe say a bit about the concern for democracy early on in the kind of Western experiment, and how the pressures or elements that Plato diagnoses there have, continued to shape the challenges we face.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we jump ahead quite far, you get the rise of democratic movements, and you were thinking like here, like the 18th and 19th century, really. So if we want to jump ahead that far, which I think is helpful to do. Athenian democracy is ostensibly, all citizen males can vote. In theory, maybe something like 30% of the population, but you also have to have enough time to take off work and go sit around in the agora and debate legislation all day. So we're talking about a subset of an already minority who can vote. During the American Revolution, especially in the French Revolution, you start to get more of this question of who ought to be able to vote. Okay, so only men, of course, but do we need those men to be property owning? Do they have to be part of the citizen militias or the National Guard? That type of stuff. And then what we think of as modern political philosophy sort of split between left and right sort of starts to emerge downstream of the tennis court oath in the National Assembly and the French Revolution, right? I mean, the left-right binary literally emerges from, they were meeting in like what used to be a horse training stable that was just a large square room during the French National Assembly when they're trying to write their constitution. And as people do, they group together with like-minded people. And it just so happened to be that the monarchists happened to be on the right side of the room and the radicals were on the left, right? The Jacobins and, all that crowd. So, in my talk, I try to pull some strings out and try to think, okay, so by the revolutions of 1848, which in my experience, most people don't know hardly anything about. The revolutions of 1848, if you don't know, are a period in which in 5 major theaters, so we're thinking France, Prussia, which is the north of Germany. Germany didn't quite exist. The Italian peninsula, so Italy didn't quite exist, but there were some wars for independence. And then Austria and Hungary, we see the rise of democratic demands for people, wanting to overthrow their monarchies and have constitutional governments. And so you start to get these new terms. On the left wing, we get, of course, communist, socialist, anarchist. The revolutions of 1848 had just kind of the pure historical accident of coming right after the Communist Manifesto was published in February of 1848. And that document had basically no role to play whatsoever in the actual revolutions of 1848. But we do see people who call themselves Republicans, right, which is a more of a left-wing term at the time, right? It means people who are calling not for absolute monarchies, but for constitutional governments with representative assemblies. We see Democrats. Democrats are going to be those who want the people to have a say, which is different than having a Republican who wants constitutional rights that we would read as liberty, right? So if you think like classic liberal liberties are first and foremost, maybe this one will come back, but this has kind of been dormant for a while, but like not getting arrested without charge by the secret police and disappearing in a dungeon, right? Like one of the foundational, right? Yeah. But you also, the things that you would recognize from your First Amendment, right? Like freedom to associate, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to education. You see demands for academic freedom among educators in this time. So that all of that's going on in the revolutions of 1848. And it doesn't stand to reason that somebody who wants constitutional government necessarily wants everyone to get a vote, right? There's going to be some overlap between Republicans and Democrats with the small d and small r here, right? But for some people who are Republicans who want constitutional government, the voice of the people is a terrifying thing, right? Vox populi, vox dei. The voice of people is the voice of God. That's a terrifying proposition for some people who are wanting constitutional governments, but also want to preserve at least some of the liberties and excesses and privileges of the traditional noble hierarchy, right? And so what I try to paint in my picture is that by the revolutions of 1848, when we really see lots of experiments in democracies, in constitutional governments, many of which like make some gains that are then reversed by the end of the year. What is kind of salient in all of that is this split between the political question and the social question, right? The political question being like, ought people to have formal, legal, constitutionally inscribed rights, liberal rights? Or do we want to have absolute monarchs? Or do we want to have some sort of enlightened despotism like we get out of the French Revolution, where your monarch is looking after the people and, familiar with Rousseau, but like also retains most of his power, right? So on the political question, ought people have constitutional rights? The conservative answer is no. The liberal or radical answer is yes. But in the revolutions of 1848, you also get a further split on the social question, right? This is a period of industrialization. England's ahead of Europe on this by a stretch, but you are starting to see industrialization, which means you're seeing people pressed into cities, which means you see for the first time the rise of mass poverty concentrated in cities. So the social question is, what do we do with all of these poor people? Wait, is this something that we need to care about, or do they all just get rights and that's fine, right? So someone can answer the political question, yeah, we should all have the same constitutional rights, but then answer no on the social question of ought everyone actually be equal? Does everyone deserve access to bread, right? And so you end up getting these contradictions where you could say, if you answer yes on the political question but no on the social egalitarian question, you could end up in these contradictions where you say, like, the rich and the poor alike have the right to live under a bridge if they so desire, right? Whereas somebody who's more on the left wing of that will say, no, people deserve to be able to eat, to have housing. We want a more egalitarian future. And it's important to say that, like, the differences between socialists are very, very wide at the time, right? You have some socialists that, like Marx, want to get rid of private property altogether, but then you have guys like Proudhon who think we can take our surplus accumulation and turn it into property but owned by the people, and, he has a different way. And you have various utopian movements that try to square it in different ways. I guess to kind of like tie a bow on that, like what we think of as democracy, it's always a moving target, and what people mean by democracy has a wide disparity in it, because some people want to have certain types of rights but preserve other types of hierarchies and privileges. And that is worth saying. I mean, one example of that, to maybe close on that question, is people who are in favor of democratic rights will very often think that your workplace should not be a democracy, right? You go to work, you need to be told what to do and how to act and how to behave yourself and live under the little tyrant of a boss. And then you can go and vote for president, sure, and that makes the big decisions about whether or not to end the biosphere or nuke us all to death or, start a war or tax you. But in work, like, you need to have a tyranny at work, of course, right? And so we can pull those threads and think about a wide disparity in what becomes liberal political thought.
Yeah. And I mean, the example of workspaces without democracy is similar to feminist observations about the home, that, we have democracy, but, the patriarchy exists in so many homes, and you got the father at the top and the wife and the kids. And one of the challenges in thinking about democracy is whether it's a description of hypothetically ideal power relations across all the spheres of life, or is it limited in this specific sense? And
yeah. I'm teaching Federici's Wages for Housework essay next week, actually. This is precisely one of her points, right? Capitalism actually demands that men do 8 hours of labor, perhaps, right? So if you have an 8-hour working day, but women have to do 8 hours and then do like another 8 hours on either side of that,
right,
taking care of the home, right? I'm even thinking like capitalism requires a massive amount of unpaid labor, and it's not clear that it could function and still have GDP growth if it was actually paying people for all of the labor they do rather than just the labor that they do between the start and the end of the workday. Right, for sure.
Because there was I don't even know if I couldn't figure out exactly if it was a question. It was more of an observation to make sure they were following you email. But one of the challenges that it was making present is that distinction of what spheres of life is democracy fit for, and the kind of resistance that often, more conservative individuals are going to resist to it, because you get the preserving a more hierarchical power relation within the home or within the workspace. But it also seems that when you're in your lecture where you're talking about the twin problems of our current crisis, there's also this drive. You talk about the libidinal economy of desire, of this drive where the power leveraged by members within a democracy are then used to resist democracy in other spheres of life. There were some questions about what's going on in these twin problems. And the first one you name about the political economy, where there's just the ongoing decline of American empire, the rise of far-right fascism globally, the extinction of a conservative party that's at least feigning commitment to democratic.
Feigning, yeah.
Yeah,
Sometimes
yeah.
not so much.
Yeah, yeah, commitment to democracy, and I think those are ones that most of the people that lectures were addressing. But it's that other side of the economy of desire that really, like, when you capture that, the rest of what you were discussing makes sense. So I'd love for you to take some time to talk about, and you give the Altizer quote in it about like how people construct imaginary relationships to real situations.
Althusser, yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Not the
Not
radical
Altizer,
theologian.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean that's such a rich question. There's so many places to go. I mean, I think of first off, like in the Black communist and Black feminist tradition, you get this concept of like a triple oppression, right? Like, so we're not just talking about like working class exploitation in the way that Marx does for the accumulation of surplus value, but you're also talking about patriarchy, you're talking about racism, it sort of layer onto each other. We could also add, like, we could make a triple if we want to add that you're perhaps queer as well, right? And these types of oppressions, coalesce to produce something that seem to operate more than the sum of their parts, right? And so
Right.
One place I was thinking about this in the last few days is like there was a new batch of like citizenship tests, that the State Department's putting out for people. And like one of the questions is, what year did women get the right to vote in the U.S.? And the answer is supposed to be, like 1920 or something, but like that is not true if you're Black or Indigenous, right? Like that
Right.
is not when you got the right to vote. So it is not true to say that is that amendment squared that problem away. Yeah, and so when I don't know where to go with that. Like, what part of that should we hit?
There were a number of questions about, is that kind of the psychoanalytic lens, right? The function of desire and how it plays out in these areas, right? Like part of what you've developed in multiple books, or like what's gained through the psychoanalytic tradition in analyzing both desire, ideology, the kind of precognitive formation that so many people that we're formed into when we're just part of this social experiment that we're in. And
Right.
And there are a couple of people that are like, I'd never even thought about this being the unexamined engine of so many of the process. So they were interested, like, how develop that for me, help me understand that kind of the libidinal desire engine.
Yeah, if we kind of like really want to stretch back, like when in the 17th and 18th centuries, when people groups or nations are coming online, and then with it, race is a way to retroactively construct why the transatlantic slave trade is the good thing, right? And then once that starts to wane, we have to like invent phrenology and other types of like race pseudosciences to sort of distribute power and difference in some sort of biological sense, where we're increasingly trying to think of race as something that's biologically real rather than something that's vibrantly socially real but not biological in origin. In the same way that like a religion is vibrantly socially real. I mean, we could even think, the concepts of race, for example, are mapped onto phenotypes, which are related to genotypes, of course, but grouping people together by race and then using that race category as a heuristic for how to distribute resources, as all capitalisms do. There's never been a non-racist version of capitalism, right? That's an extremely useful heuristic, and people just map that as, oh yeah, people are Black or white or something else, right? Other types of phenotypes, you never think to divide people. I'm 6'2". I've never been asked if I identify as a tall or a short. I've definitely never been asked if my height, if someone was to say, oh, your height doesn't actually matter. What matters is, do you have even one short within your family history? Because then you are legally a short, right? Thinking here like with an analog to like the one drop rule and the construction of race, right? In America, we see like a big shift into enslavement once white indentured servants from Europe start outliving their 7-year term and are entitled to like land and payment after the end of their indentured servitude term, right? And it becomes increasingly important in America for people to imagine that they are white, a term that I take from like Ta-Nehisi Coates' book Between the World and Me. I always was really impressed with the way that he talks about white people as people who imagine or believe that they are white. Like that becomes increasingly important. I mean, you can think through like Civil War, right? If you were a Southern planter and you're needing to raise an army to defend your enslavement of human beings, you need your poor white population to think of themselves not as poor, but as white, right? Because because otherwise they might realize that they have more in common with people who are suffering. And so if we fast forward to thinking about this as like a libidinal economy desire, I always have in the back of my mind a psychoanalyst that I met in Denver who once made a very off-the-cuff statement that haunts me all of the time. She said, what matters is not reality. What matters is what people say about reality, which feels like America in 2025 is one big experiment in that type of dynamic, right? But what people say about reality is, attesting to some sort of desire function, right? Or the people curate their realities with fantasies, right? Again, this is the Althusser observation of ideology is an imaginary relationship to a real situation, or I think his exact wording is ideology represents for the subject an imagined relationship to a concrete situation, right? You can't get by without ideologies. I, for one, think that it is better to get an ideology that maps onto the real situation as closely as possible. But some people, that's inconvenient to as the time. It requires me to reimagine things, and I don't want to reimagine things. So I'm just going to imagine things as they are. One way that you can kind of think about like ideology of whiteness and sort of intersecting with heteropatriarchy, like in America, is of course like the tool of the gun, right? Like a very phallic symbol that lets people feel strong. Suturing this to like the phenomenon of mass shootings on the one hand and suicides on the other, right? So 40,000 thereabouts people die per year from gun deaths in the U.S. 2/3 of that are suicides. And then the average mass shooting is not like in the grocery store or the school where we expect them to be. The average mass shooting is when a man lights up his entire family, kills his wife, and then shoots himself, right? And that meets the standard threshold of 4 people shot to qualify as a mass shooting, right? So like one way to think about like libidinal economies of desire, how many people want to shoot themselves? Well, what you're essentially doing is you're providing a tool there, which has always been intractably about white power over black people, right? Like the gun is there to, first of all, like you have to have a gun if you're going to be part of a slave patrol or in fear of a slave uprising in the antebellum South. This is especially true in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, right? Where people actually do have a slave uprising that leads to the, to date, only successful slave uprising that leads to a new state. This is very much in the background in the antebellum South. Could this happen here? So the gun has always been important as a way to kind of assert power, even if one does not ever pull the gun out and point it at somebody. The very fact that you have a gun hidden inside your coat or around your ankle lets you have a certain amount of imagined power. But what we find is we can think of, there's a book on this, on the wages of whiteness, if you will, that kind of says if we're thinking about the gun as a suicide instrument, though, one of the reasons that men are so successful at killing themselves is that men tend to kill themselves with guns or running their cars into things, whereas women tend to prefer pills, right, which have a much lower rate of success, right? And so this weapon that you have as a way to feel strong or to feel protected from the other, and you might not say what that other's race or skin color is, but you have that in the background, that ends up being the tool that, like, when the triggering event happens, I think among people who kill themselves with guns, on average, there's only like a 60-minute interval between the triggering events. You get fired, your girlfriend breaks up with you or whatever. There's on average a very, very short interval between that triggering event and when they kill themselves, right? And so if I'm speaking more abstractly as a Freudian here, I'm always tempted to invoke the notion of death drive here, right? Which Freud proposes after the First World War and the Spanish flu takes his daughter as well as millions of other people. More people died in the Spanish flu than died in World War I, if I recall correctly, right? So it's an immensely grim time for Freud. He starts talking about this death drive. And he specifically talks about a death drive as being something that can't be accounted for in the life instincts. It's not there to preserve you, but it's not there just to harm others. It's also to harm oneself, right? Like it gives you a certain type of access to enjoyment that you don't get if you're just trying to survive, right? I mean, my go-to example is like, what's the pleasure in smoking and how does that change after we know that smoking causes cancer, right? One of the things that after we know that link is possible in smoking is that you get to express a certain, yes, this is bad for me, but I'm expressing how carefree I am. I'm doing this knowing it's destructive, but hey, I have a lot of stress. And so there's an additional type of enjoyment that one can get from doing something that is self-destructive. And then I think the interesting political question here to kind of spin this out is the classic sort of liberal diagnosis of conservatism is going to be like people must be willing to accept highly hierarchical and dehumanizing and humiliating suffering conditions for themselves because they get to do them even worse to other people, right? And I think that gets you a fair way to the actual problem, right? But like the more concerning thing is like, what if we reverse it? What if the drive to destroy oneself or to humiliate oneself or to make oneself subservient is primary, and the way you try to square that and not think about that self-destructive element too much is that you are harmful to others, right? As a cover, right? And I don't think that actually should be even that controversial, because you just think I don't know, to say like a woman in a very conservative church that doesn't allow her to have authority and tells her she needs to be in the home, cranking out children as much as possible. Like she will very often say, I enjoy this life of being subservient, of having the figure of the masculine man who's taking care of all of this. And so like I enjoy being in this heteropatriarchal position of servitude. And also it's so awful that not all women have to be in that position. We need to go back to that, right? You can probably think pretty quickly to examples in which people will vocally express that they want to be subservient to someone else, and then that has like an outgrowth of hostility to others that aren't complying with your preferred lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that you gave a number of examples where you can see how the agreed upon reality we're discussing or engaging with is detached from the actual material conditions and really overdetermined by ideological constructs that so much of their power, right, is covering over the material conditions and giving a narrative or orientation where you're invested in the construct itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's depressing. One of the things you start talking about in the essay is there's a growing awareness that America is an empire in decline,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's, decimating scientific research, failing education quality, rising costs of like home and health care, high imprisonment rates, growing inequality, these kinds of things. And when you start to give an analysis of the material conditions, you develop kind of the oil arms dollar nexus.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that you spell out rather clearly in the lecture, but I wonder if you can kind of introduce how the connection between oil arms and dollars helps us understand both the kind of material engine of American empire and the crisis that it's experiencing internally. Because I think the popular narrative is something like, oh well, now we're no longer the unitary power after the war, and we're trying to move in this global space. And then there's this awakening in the populist on both the left and right of like how the neoliberal expression of our economic system created these problems, and now we don't know what to do with it. But at the 10,000-foot story you tell, that the relationship of oil, the military industrial complex, and the role of the dollar, right, in the post-World War II period really shapes reality.
Yeah. So I developed this three-way relationship between the dollar, oil, and the arms trade. And the arms trade is very much a daughter adjunct to the primary relationship between the dollar and oil. I think that people very often have this picture of the Industrial Revolution to present as being one about like advanced technologies, right? And the technologies definitely do advance, right? But the energy behind those technologies is what's driving that, right? So like people will talk about like the railroads, but what were the railroads invented to transport, right? It was coal and then eventually oil as well. So one way to kind of think about all of that is 1859 is when Edwin Drake first drills his commercially successful oil well in Pennsylvania. Rockefeller found Standard Oil in 1870, I believe. And then I trace out the history of several other companies. There's this one fascinating little British company that was trading seashells that merges with a Dutch company to become Shell, or Royal Dutch Shell, right? If we're thinking about energy, wood was the primary energy source, wood and other types of biomass for millennia. There's always been like counterexamples to that. Europe has used some amount of coal for heating going back very far. Like there's bitumen and other types of oils that seem to be kind of traced to like why, the Iranians came up with Zoroastrianism as these ever-present fires that just like light up on the rocks and then never go out and stuff like that. But in the late 19th century, so like 1869 on, especially 1870 after Standard Oil, you start to get these oil firms that pop up. And whereas wood had a energy investment, energy return ratio of 4-to-1, you put 1 unit of energy into wood and get 4 units back. Coal's been pretty stable around 18-to-1, right? And we just have far, far too much coal. So when we initially drilled it, you find estimates as high as 100-to-1 or even 150-to-1. Oil's in return on investment now is more like 16 or 17-to-1, which is more in the range of renewables. But you get an explosion. There's just nothing like oil. Now, so if we're thinking like military power, Western fleets start converting themselves into coal-powered steamships in the mid-19th century. Most notably, and I think importantly, the British assault Akka in northern Israel when the Egyptians started their own industrial revolution founded by coal and started expanding out and took over Palestine. Britain comes in and wants to engage and blow up Akka, a site that I've actually visited, the exact fortress that they blew up. They pound Palestine at this old Turkish fort that the Egyptians had taken, ended up like landing a perfect shot at the powder magazine and blow up thousands of people in an instant in the city. And then they march through like Lebanon and down through like they're in Gaza by December or something like that in 1840. But like for the rest of the 19th century, the coal-powered steamship is really essential, and that persists on through World War I. But after World War I, everybody starts converting all of their energy resources to oil, right? Oil's much easier to handle. You can transport it in different ways. You can run a ship on steam powered by coal, right? But you can't really run a Jeep or a tank on coal in the same way, right? So there's this big push to move everything to oil. And that presents a problem for Europe because just as a result of geology in deep time, Europe doesn't have very much oil. It has a lot of coal, but not very much oil. So they have to look out. Their first foray is to Iran, right? So they establish a guy named Darcy gets a lease in 1901 to, I don't know like how far back we want to go in Iran's relationship here, but Iran has been kind of ruled by this point for a while under the authority of these shahs, kings, which went through several successive dynasties going back to, I think, 1601 or thereabouts is when the first shah or leader in Iran makes Shia Islam like the dominant faith and kind of displaces older Zoroastrian traditions. But in the 19th century, for example, the penultimate dynasty of Shahs in Iran started giving out concessions to Western firms, mainly British. Like these concessions are basically you can take over our fisheries or you can take over our communication infrastructure, you can take over our tobacco industry. But one of the important ones in 1901 is you can take over all of our oil if you can find it, right? Good luck finding it. And so they give this concession to this British guy, Darcy, who spends the better part of a decade trying to find oil in Iran, can't do it until 1909 when he finally strikes oil. And then they are given a 60-year lease on oil that should stretch from 1901 to 1961. Part of the relationship here in Arabian, the British find in Iran a compliant state where they can set up this Anglo-Persian oil company, which eventually becomes Anglo-Iranian in the 30s because the new Shah wants to call Iran instead of Persia. But it's a very extractive process, right? One way to read World War II when it comes out, right? Germany had enough oil on hand to last really well for a few weeks or months, but it didn't have an oil source. So what it eventually had to do was invade the Soviet Union and try to get into some of these Balkan states and like southern Soviet orbit areas like the Baku oil fields where there is like a lot of oil. And that awakes the bear. And once you trigger the Soviets, they're going to come in and crush you. And so the Soviets end up winning World War II with a tiny bit of our help at the end. But yeah, so like the U.S. didn't have this problem. The U.S. has a lot of oil because of its geology. During the Cretaceous period, it was covered in the south with a shallow sea, which for millions of years left like animals dying, falling to the seafloor, which creates fertile soil. Once the seas retreat, that fertile soil becomes the black belt, right? So carbon dioxide and sea levels during the Cretaceous have a direct connection to the institution of slavery across the South and setting up our racial relations today, which is wild to think about. During the Permian period, the greatest extinction of all time, when 95% of animals died, that left massive, massive oil deposits in Texas. So like Europe and America's relationship is very different. America starts finding all this oil in California, Texas, the Northeast, and so forth. sets up these oil firms. And then these oil firms, once they realize that the Middle East has a lot of oil, they start trying to get these concessions as well. So like a concession is a government will let you dig up its resources, some sheikdom, and you provide royalties to that government. In Iran, it was like a 16% fee for a while, but in Saudi Arabia, it was like a 50-50 split, right? Saudi Arabia was much more compliant. This creates some instability in Iran. And basically, the long story short, if we're trying to condense some things here and trying to wind this down, is that if a state in the Middle East is not complying with Western oil interested, they get attacked. They get overthrown, right? So the first example of this is in 1949 when the CIA does its first coup, 2 years after its founding, actually. It does its first coup in Syria. It's often said to be the first coup is in Guatemala in 54, but it seems to be that they were probably behind the 1949 coup in Syria. And what was the problem? Well, the Saudis had wanted to develop an oil pipeline that goes from Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean Sea, and it needed to run through Syria, and Syria said no, so we overthrew their government. We did the same thing by overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, the prime minister who wanted to nationalize Iran's oil. So we overthrew him. It was done almost entirely through a CIA operative named Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. It's really weird to, you can't blame this for us, but it is weird to think of your entire society being overthrown by a guy named Kermit. But yes, he was kind of monomaniacally focused on getting Western interest in Iran pushed through. Churchill was behind it as well. Like he thought, like, why are these Iranians? Why can't they play ball with us or whatever else? A similar thing happens in Iraq. So we have the Turkish Petroleum Company, which becomes the Iranian or Iraqi Petroleum Company, which is a group of Western interests, right? They're always named after the area that they're in, but they're Americans that are basically running the show. And so that oil industry sets up in Iraq. And then when they have their own socialist revolution led by Qasim and Arif, Qasim, a socialist, floats getting rid of these Western companies and just nationalizing the oil supply. So the CIA comes in the 60s and does a coup on Qasim and gets him overthrown and provides a little upstart, the Ba'ath Party, with this guy Saddam Hussein. The CIA literally hands them a list of communists and says, you're just going to work down this list and kill everybody that we tell you to kill. Hey, buddy. And then double crosses him later on, of course. But yeah, I mean, like this whole history is one of Western intervention in these Gulf sheikdoms and Middle East states. Yeah, I always would kind of emphasize this because most Americans don't know very much about the history of Arab revolutions, but a lot of these Arab revolutions were explicitly calling themselves socialist. And so you start to see like the Eisenhower doctrine in the 50s that's very friendly to the idea of overthrowing Iran. Eisenhower very explicitly links anti-communism and oil access. To him, they are one and the same. And it's easy to read all of this as being about oil now, but there is an ideological component of anti-communism because these Gulf states were very often calling themselves socialist, right? To them, that meant like socialism is a nationalist project of overthrowing Western imperialism and creating a bunch of sovereign wealth for ourselves, right? So like that idea spreads to as far as Algeria. It's definitely part of the understanding of Palestine, which maybe we can get into in a bit. But once we get the Mahdi Pact in 1959, an agreement between two states that we're hearing a lot about, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, right? Venezuela, another people group that will not give us all their oil, and so we've never forgiven them for it. So the Mahdi Pact sets up like a joint committee between Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Kuwait, and maybe one or two others. I can't remember exactly. That later on becomes OPEC the next year, and then OPEC expands quite a bit over the 70s. But importantly, in 1975, OPEC starts trading oil exclusively in the dollar. Right. So Nixon had taken us off the gold standard at the beginning of the 70s. And then just a few years later, oil, the primary energy input in the entire world, by the 60s, in the 70s, that oil is being traded only in US dollars. That means that if you are a state that has oil imports, you have to keep massive reserves of US dollars on hand, right, which keeps the relationship very strong. And then like the last relationship there is arms trade, which is a very small by comparison to the oil industry. The arms trade is like $140 billion a year, whereas the oil, gas, and coal industry is pretty split evenly, about $2 trillion each to add up to $6 trillion. But that $6 trillion funds 80% of the 110 plus trillion global economy every year. So these arms trades are essentially part of these bilateral relationships that the U.S. and Britain and various other Western states will organize with these Gulf sheikdoms and monarchies to say, you know, you give us our oil, we'll give you a cut of the royalties, and we will also give you arms to shore up your security situation, right? And what that means, like today, we can think of kind of two things. What, if you have an F-35 fleet, you can't swap that out for like just another jet or another part. Like you are committed to buying from Lockheed Martin for a while, which means that you are dependent on arms transfer authorizations. And it doesn't matter if it's Biden or Trump. You have to play ball with whoever it is if you want those weapon systems to continue, right? Or else you get cut off and you can get overthrown. What it also means is if China or one of the other BRIC states wants to fund a project in your backyard, you have to weigh your domestic security situation with maybe a very lucrative deal, but that could cut you off from your arms transfer, right? So it's a way to shore up bilateral relationships between the West and these various states. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see once you have some awareness of that history, then all sorts of the weird things Trump has been doing in the Middle East, where you're like, exactly how did a Republican get around to doing this? Is more or less following the playbook, but just doing it explicitly and in public.
There's a lot of only Nixon can go to China moments with Trump, right? Like how could anybody get away with this or that?
But like when you think of it, so much of the way in which he's related to different Middle East nations is a more transparent version of what we've been up to the whole time, right? Like of this connection of we're providing all this military support and you're now like brought in to our arms area. It helps you control your state, whether or not the people want this kind of relationship. And you're hooking us up with oil. Now we've also added in that Israel's really good at using technology for surveillance of citizenry. And so the one of the things that multiple people in response was like, oh, like as much as I'm going, I don't know, Tad, this seems really depressing. This is really intense. I don't know about this. But that there were multiple people that said, well, I guess that makes sense why Trump's doing X, Y, and Z. He's just doing it out loud rather than in a dark room of sorts.
I think what's genuinely new with Trump is how obvious the quid pro quo is, right?
Yeah.
There was a report the other day that said, like the Trump organization's been pulling in 40 or 50 million a year, and then like in the last year it went up to 850 million, and a massive jump in profits. 800 of that is just crypto investment. A lot of that's coming from Saudis, and so which crypto is one way to think about an unregulated security because it's not used as an actual currency unless you need to like do some ransomware attack or it's basically as a currency it's useful for hiding bribes and fraud, right? And so for most people, crypto is just about an unregulated security where you're trying to gamble because you've been told like this is a very easy way to make money or whatever else. If you're a high-level state, it's a very obvious, extremely easy way to hide transactions directly to an American president, right? And so so if you're Trump and you want to make $1 billion in a year, then you can just signal to the Saudis, just pump up my crypto assets, and then you can do whatever you want with the Yemenis or whoever else, right?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, if you think of, he's gotten almost $3 billion in crypto, almost $1 billion just from different law firms. Qatar gave him a $400 million plane. You got multiple news and social media organizations giving him money. Apparently, he wants $230 million from the Department of Justice, and these kind of things where like underneath all of those, be it media, the control of what people actually see about their neighbors and news and these kinds of things, to like being purchased from other nations, buying influence and such. All those things, if you just thought democracy mattered, there's a reason no one has done it like this before, and it would normally be a problem, right?
Right.
But like in some sense, he's getting a highlighter out and just being like, let me tell you how things really work. And so I'm just going to go do it and do it bigly.
Right. Yeah.
You throw that on with the big, beautiful bill and throwing, like Google and Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, giant $1 billion tax breaks, and then getting a new ballroom, but still being unable to figure out how to do SNAP payments.
Right.
I think a lot of people in America would like to see what he's doing as an exception to American democracy. And one of the things a lot of your analysis does is, well, what if it's not a giant exception, but an exemplification of the powers that have actually been running through it the whole time? it's in a sense making it transparent to understand the tension in democracy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, cutting SNAP benefits is a really great example of this, right? We're used to seeing planned starvations of other people groups in the world, right? When cutting SNAP benefits is going to affect 1 in 8 Americans, right? Most of which are like families, right? We're talking like children, working mothers who aren't making enough at their job at Walmart, and so they have to go on public assistance. So, like, this is more or less a type of planned mini starvation that's going to be intentionally administered by the state. And this turns out to be something that is pretty quotidian in the world, right? Like, north of 30,000 people a day die from malnutrition or malnutrition related diseases. And we're used to seeing the starvation elsewhere, but, we also take it as thoroughly normal that 40,000 people liquidate themselves with guns every year. 60,000 people die for lack of access to health care that you get in every other developed state, right? Almost 1 in 6 people in the world, including many Americans, die from fossil fuels, right? Like just from the exhaust from like the CO2 and particulate matter. There's a massive amount of violence that's just baked in. It becomes clearer when, I don't know, thinking here of, one of the examples I've worked on a lot is like the use of AI drones in Israel that it's, for years used armed and fully automatable. They claim, Israel's always claimed that it's drones that police the border of Gaza, always have a man in the loop, which means like an 18-year-old on an iPad that making kill decisions. But like all of these drones, one of the dreams of AI is to have fully automated kill bots, right? And so these already exist. They are already being used. They have been used quite a bit in Gaza in the last year, fully automated kill bots. Or at least I want to hedge myself a little bit. We do have hunter-killer drones, but there's always some question about whether or not there's a man in the loop or if these are acting on their own volition or programming. But like
I had a student last year in an AI and religion class who is in military intelligence and in that, and I'll just say he did not convince me that at the heart of the American democracy is continuing to have our treaty obligations, human rights commitments as a bulwark against automated death.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like Israel's interesting here. If you think about just the mere fact that like Israel does a lot of training for American police and border patrol, right? Israel buys a lot of American weapons and is dependent on American weapon systems, but they also develop a lot of their own through their research universities, and they use Gaza traditionally as a type of open range because once you can say that this drone has killed Gazans from the sky, you can sell that as quote unquote battle tested on the world arms market, right? So it's actually useful to have a shooting range full of innocent families, right? However, I think it's also interesting that Israel, when it talks about its weapon systems, it will often emphasize that these can be loaded with less lethal rounds like beanbags or rubber bullets or tear gas canisters, which is to say the little hunter-killer drone that you might see in Gaza might just show up with a slightly less lethal round at a protest near you, protesting what's happening in Gaza or the climate crisis or whatever else, right?
We all get to protest freely in America.
Right, yeah, but I mean, it is really, it's a full circle, right? Like the powers that be have a particular imaginary of skin color and importantly wealth, right? Because wealth has kind of like the effect of changing your racial status at a certain echelon, right? There's a certain hierarchy kind of built into this, and that's coming home to roost in a very kind of open way when we kind of see, I don't know, like what's one of the most stable, dependable jobs you can get in America right now? It's like signing up for ICE, right? You can be a completely unemployable, undependable monster with no training, and you sign up for a full-time job with federal benefits, and you get a $50,000 signing bonus to do this, and all you got to do is sign up to be in the racism police. That's a really lucrative investment for a lot of people, and so although it's kind of weird that so many of them are having trouble passing the physical fitness test. There's like a report out that like a third of the new ICE recruits aren't able to pass the physical fitness test, which is like literally just like doing 15 push-ups and running 1.5 miles in 14 minutes. Even if you dangle $50,000 in front of somebody, they can't pull it together for that. But yeah, I mean, like when Obama gave his address to the Coast Guard graduation like a few years back, he talked about how Border Patrol is at the forefront of American interests, I guess he said. He started talking about like even states in the Middle East, and he's talking about because when I think of Coast Guard, I think of a guy in a helicopter like jumping out of it to rescue like some poor person on a sailboat who's gotten caught in a storm, right? Well, what the Coast Guard actually does involves a lot of killing people who are ostensibly drug runners runners or something like that. But like that, the concept of drug running or human trafficking are very often stand-ins for this group of people is killable. And so all of that's completely normalized. I mean, like one other example that I kind of briefly touch on is just like the normalization of American imperial military violence. It's still common even among liberal circles to like think of the military as something that's very appropriate or brave, or like that it's rendered as like a type of service, when we've known for a long time, going back centuries, most of the people who die in military conflicts are civilians, right? Like at minimum we're talking 50%. Usually it's more like 2/3 or 3/4. And in modern urban environments, which is where we're doing a lot of the special operations, the civilian casualties make up 85 to 90%, right? So the picture you should be making is that military work, insofar as it leads to death, is mostly killing civilians and children, right? Probably thereabouts half of the people that a military kills are children, either directly or indirectly, right? And we just don't think of that, right? You can still find estimates on like how many people did the war on terror kill, and you can find estimates that are in the low hundreds of thousands, right? You can also find estimates that take into direct and indirect deaths that's 4.5 million. So that all of that death is just kind of out of sight, out of mind, and it's just considered normal and a type of service to engage in that type of killing work. And I'm sensitive to that because I think that, people that I know who are in the military who will talk about this kind of moral conundrum that they're in will very often say, yes, I'm proud of some aspects of what the military gave me. When I signed up as an 18-year-old, I had no idea I was killing 90% families, right? And so nobody knows that going into you, even if the data is all out there public for anybody that wants to Google it. And so it's an interesting moral problem to kind of think through, like how people create those imaginaries and imagine themselves good, and when what they are doing is a type of violence that is, as we're talking about now, coming full circle in interesting, continually surprising and troubling ways.
Yeah, underneath this, the kind of three different interlocking kind of power system there of the dollar and the military and oil is that it ends up generating our inability, right, to both acknowledge the larger climate crisis or really to respond in any significant way. And when the power structure that so many people within the most powerful democracies are attached to kind of necessitate it, then what would it even mean for us to acknowledge like the web of influence these commitments already have in it? You talk about in the lecture how since the 1850s they were the oil companies were aware of the consequences, right, of carbon dioxide.
Early scientists in the 1850s, Eunice Foote and John Tyndall, one of which Marx was actually reading but didn't understand what he was reading well enough to incorporate into Capital. But the basic climate science of like CO2 as a warming agent was known before the American Civil War, and then oil companies started talking about it a lot in the 1970s.
And then they stopped talking about it.
And they stopped talking about it.
But when you talk about how 90% of the excess energy ends up going into the oceans, we have this energy imbalance where like 1 million Hiroshima bombs are going off daily. And we're like growingly aware of kind of the systemic effects like sea level rise, drop of crop yields, which is going to get increasingly worse, that the amplification of inequalities across all sorts of different political situations are going there with, and then you throw on all the indirect effects of flooding, wildfires, migration, and such. And when you're starting to deal with that, and then going, hey, what can liberal democracy do about this? You have a very big, large, wet blanket. There are these structural limitations where we're 4/5 of the global GDP depends on fossil fuels. In some sense, democracies with capitalism have always required an exploited class, and as the market and the connections and transportation move, so much of that exploited class we move to other places so we don't have to see it or protect ourselves from being fully aware of it. We start outsourcing through just-in-time ordering and resource allocation from elsewhere. Like we're distancing ourselves from some of it, and like when you start looking at it, there's this challenge that elections are all run on short-term questions, and then the things threatening our future are long-term crises where the incentive structures aren't even there, right? So when you're thinking about liberal democracy in just the structural limitations, what's your diagnosis that, could provoke, I don't know, something approaching a generative response?
Well, I don't know if I have a lot of good news. I mean, like the good news in the climate crisis is that like we have all of the technologies that we need. We need a lot of scaling up, but my go-to example is we could supply all 19 terawatts of energy that the Earth system runs on, or the civilization runs on every day, just by covering as little as 1/2 of 1% of our landmass in solar panels, right? And solar panels are made of they're silicates. They're made of it's sand, right? Like we have plenty of sand. There's also just the downstream problems with like toxic waste and recycling problems and stuff like that. It's not the case that we have all of the tech we need, but we have the main apparatus of technology that we need already. We know how to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It takes about twice as much energy to pull it out as it does to put it in the first place. So maybe it's better just to wind down things and not burn fossil fuels. But like we know how to do that. The problem is that it's not lucrative, right? There's a really great book on this recently by Brett Christopher called The Price is Wrong from Verso as well, that talks about like why is it the case that renewables are now as cheap or cheaper than fossil fuels, but they don't seem to be driving an energy transition the way that the forever climatologists and energy systems people hoped that they would. And it turns out that like part of the problem is that capital doesn't reward the commodity that is cheapest. It rewards the commodity that can produce the best return on investment. And there's a number of problems with renewables and the way that they're funded and the way that they experience intermittency issues where, like the sun isn't always out, the wind's not always blowing. You don't have that problem with fossil fuels. You just don't, if you're not going to make money on the plant that day, you just don't turn on the natural gas that day. And so there's advantages that fossil fuels like coal and gas have in terms of electricity generation, right? So oil here is not the issue because oil's not really involved in electricity generation. But yeah, like thinking about these problems, like there was an idea for a long time, which I think that like religious studies people can probably like laugh about. There was an idea in climate community that if just enough people knew about all of the problems, that this would drive change. This is actually when you read the old memos from Exxon and Mobil in the 70s and 80s, this is precisely their concern, right? That if people wake up to it and they realize we're going to lose Washington, D.C. and the state of Florida and New Orleans and parts of New York and Philadelphia, and if they realize that, they're going to force us to strand operations, so we need to misdirect them. That does not appear to be true, or at least the oil industry doesn't appear to be worried about that at this point, right? So awareness is higher than it's ever been, but that's not driving an energy transition. And so how do we think about that? Well, again, I think religious studies people should be like pretty familiar with the idea that actually people's beliefs don't seem to matter to them that much. Like you go to a church and you're part of a community and you do a certain set of rituals because this is the way you do things and this is the people that you know. What do you believe about this specific minute theological area? Well, you'll find that everybody in the church has a different idea of it, or that they've not ever thought about it, or if they say that they have an idea of it and you ask them one additional question, they'll immediately reverse on this, this supposedly very important conviction. All that to say, religious experience gives you like a really great window into how people kind of don't care that much about like their beliefs, even very core conviction beliefs that they feel like they've developed their lives around. Those are always permeable, negotiable, changeable at a moment's notice. And I think, I always think like the most prescient and important example of this in the last 2 years has been just watching a live streamed genocide that's happening very openly. And, you get some difficulty with the way that the genocide is portrayed in American media because it's taken like a long time for people to even get to say the G word. But like in Israel press, if you're aware of that, politicians are saying pretty loudly like we want to eliminate as many of these people as we can and wipe it off the map and so forth. That gives you a really good example of how a problem can be staring liberalism directly in the face with tons and tons of evidence being live streamed. And your solution is to try to buy up TikTok because you think the problem is that too many Zoomers are getting their information about it from a media apparatus and they need to have that information shut down. That also won't work, right? Because the problem is not like information as such. It's that the powers that be, like Israel is incredibly important for having a Middle East footprint that can stamp down Arab self-assertion in the area over fossil fuels, right? So like Israel's relationship with the U.S. will continue to be extremely important until we decarbonize. And then after that, it's not clear why you would still need an Israel at that point. And so, so all of those, I think all of those examples kind of like lay bare this problem that I cite in my climate book, Future of Denial, the Gillens and Page study from a decade or so ago that said, if you think about advocacy group interests, the interest of the ultra wealthy, and then the interest of the people, public opinion seems to have zero correlation with actual policy that goes through. You can think through like lots of examples, like public health care has a favorable support north of 50%, even like more than half of Republicans at this point say that they favor some sort of universal health care system. They still can't get that. Death penalty, marijuana legalization, like if you go across the board, you just don't find federal policy reflecting what is usually favored by more than 50% of the public. So we live in a democracy, or at least we call ourselves a democracy, but we also all kind of know it's an oligarchy, to use one of Plato's other terms, that's kind of verging back and forth on tyranny. And in the world sphere, the world's looking at us and kind of thinking like, well, damn, what if the American, no matter what they commit to, they're always 4 years away from electing the stupidest person in the room who's going to not follow on any of those commitments. So there again, you get like this problem of the dollar. Well, if the dollar's been floated on oil since 1975, what do you do when, China starts using its currency to, as we've seen a few examples of recently, oil starting to be trading in Chinese currency, right? There is no future in which we decarbonize or find some way to not elect the dumbest person in the room enough, or there's no future, especially in which we decarbonize, where American power and the dollar doesn't decline, right? And when it declines, it's going to create massive, massive social unrest. It's going to kick a lot of people out of their jobs. And then one of the solutions to that is, well, socialism or barbarism, right? So you can get like a broadly egalitarian future that organizes knowing that we have all of the resources we need. Anything we can do, we can pay for, as Keynes used to say. We have the solar panels that we need. Or you can do fascism, which is another way to give people the sense of power if otherwise they're very frustrated that everyone they know is dying of opioid overdoses, and the Dollar General is where they're getting their groceries, and they have no prospects for much of America, and the schools aren't being funded anymore because anyone with any income is moving to bigger cities. Fascism is the other option that you can do to kind of square that. So yeah. So it's a quite problematic future. It is so frustrating because we have everything that we need and can't seem to pull it together, with just getting our thoughts correct about it.
Yeah. There are a couple responses to at the end of the lecture where you used the socialism or barbarism quote, and they generally had the kind of, I don't know, the pragmatic responses. If you talk about socialism or barbarism, and then you're in America where socialism just polls in a way it's not going to win an election, how does embracing a label like that help us win suburbs, which is a growing demographic if you don't want the Republican Party having even more power as they twist the levers against democracy? How does the recognition of the severity of the problem, what does treating that seriously look like given the political realities of the present?
I mean, I kind of go back and forth on my prospects for reformism versus like a revolution, right? Neither of which I feel like are super, super live options. I mean, I think the Zoran campaign in New York is like a really hopeful example, but I've seen hopeful examples before. It disappoints me. I do tend to think that, given the lack of material conditions for any sort of social revolution that doesn't seem to exist anywhere in the Western world right now, maybe it's worth putting our energy into the small gains that we can have with making people's lives slightly better. On the nomenclature of like socialism or barbarism or fascism, socialism has become like a just kind of skyrocketing in popularity among millennials, and especially, I mean, it's cross racial groups as well, right? If you take like black women have an interest in socialism today that one might not expect if one were just reading this as if it is white, fairly well-to-do, college-educated voters or something like that, right? If we're talking about socialism as like the way that Marx does, which is the definition that kind of won out after 1848, as a mode of production in which the people doing the work get paid for the full value of their work rather than only a portion of the value, the other portion going to an owner who doesn't do work. I think it's important to talk straightforwardly about what we mean by these systems and to kind of put a stake and say, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to pretend like I think liberalism has every bit of a shot as much as socialism does, because like liberalism will always have hierarchy built back into it, right? If it's going to be giving no ground on property rights, which is the classic kind of stopgap question for liberalism, we can have all the rights that we want, but we've also got to protect property. If you have property private property. If you find it conceivable, I mean, to use my example, a liberal is somebody who finds it horrifying if somebody is like not able to rent out a property because of their race or sexual orientation, right? But they still usually firmly think that it should be someone's right to own 2 houses or 10 houses or 1,000 houses and use other human beings who are lower on the status ladder than them and often of a different racial group as a surplus generating instrument, right? If that's what liberalism is, then hierarchy is built into it, right? And so I cite the socialist humanist Max Christman, who kind of says, if hierarchy is built into your conceivable options, as it is for liberals and conservatives alike, then you ultimately have only 2 options. You can look at that hierarchy and that barbarism, that brutalization, and feel awesome about it, and that's the conservative, or you can enjoy feeling very sad about it and lament it and do a land acknowledgement right before you talk about your new AI project that's going to extract wealth from, people who are kicked out of jobs and stuff like that. That's the concern I have, is that if we're not willing to talk openly about the solutions on hand, which are pretty well explored and many masked out at this point, then you're just going to go nowhere, right? And I think at the other hand, it's important to kind of talk about fascism as it is. I mean, I use Paxton, Robert. If anybody wants like a decent primer on the history of fascism, not just Italy and Germany, but like all of the Western states at that time had sort of proto-fascist movements. He defines it as, fascism as a form of political behavior marked by, on the one hand, obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, and victimhood, and on the other hand, marked with compensatory cults of unity, energy, purity, in which a mass group of nationalists working in an uneasy but effective alliance with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues, without legal or ethical constraints, an agenda of outward expansion and inward cleansing, right? And that inward cleansing is going to be both racial and ideological, right? One thing the fascists are always very adamant about is that we need to purge the people who have left-wing thoughts, right? The racial groups can kind of move around at will. Those are important for the fascist. Like, you can't have fascism without the racial target, but the target of the left-wing ideologue is always consistent. And so I think if you use these terms, you see, versions of this out in the world, and we don't need to kind of dance around what we're talking about. Fascism is one perfectly legible outcome of the climate changes, right? As the changes spin up and the inequalities get dialed up, to use another example, I use, like, even if your community is safe from sea level rise, if you pump 1 million Hiroshima atomic bombs worth of energy into the Earth system every day, that boosts the hydrological cycle. It means you get more rain, which means your basements flood more often, or fires threaten your community in the Palisades, or so forth, right? And so what that means is your primary investment instrument loses value, right? Which means that people move, segregation patterns change, businesses pull out, which means poverty changes, which means crime increases, which means police budgets balloon, which means you have food deserts. This is the dialing up of the inequality. Fascism is a perfectly legible response to that, right? Just turn up the violence even more, create safe spaces for the preferred racial and ideological groups, and just let everyone else rot.
Yeah. So one of the aspects that within America, immigration and the pace of it or volume of it has generated, a huge ongoing debate where we also just avoid having an immigration policy because everyone can run on it, and the larger market wants cheap labor without worker rights and such. So like you have that issue, and it's playing out here one way. And this past summer when I was in Europe, it plays out a little different there, and I wonder how your kind of psychoanalytic analysis can kind of frame the way it's playing out, because we're already seeing quite a bit of refugees coming into Europe, largely from, not just different racially, but culturally, religiously. And those countries are less, they aren't as good at kind of, melting pot style culture inclusion as the United States has been historically. But a lot of the animus that is an energy that's being harnessed is kind of like cultural resentment from refugees, right? And that's like the driving energy behind a lot of the right wing, like kind of far right turns politically. And like seeing that, I wonder, what does it look like to think about the material realities and recognize kind of like the the psychological, the way human beings work psychologically, like we feel safer as a species when we understand the majority of the people around us as having shared something, right? Shared network. There's most of the social psych things is once you get to 20% of the people you interact with in the day triggering like cognitive dissonance, like culturally, then you notice them and it
Right.
generates fear for your identity. Like these psychological mechanisms would lead you to think, regardless of what you think the ideal is, there is like some kind of ideal speed at which you include different communities and where they don't become closed off from the culture and then jobs and all these other kinds of things on the social side. And I mean, I'm talking like just talking to bartenders across Europe when I was
Hmm.
there, where like in Germany, who was the previous prime minister? Merkel, I think, right? Yeah, she let in a whole lot of refugees, and then there was a giant pushback to it because the volume like triggers this encounter of difference. At least the hypothesis that most of the psychologists were running with,
Hmm.
and and thinking about that and how the influx of new people into the Western countries is going to be with the number of climate refugees, and
Hmm.
just seeing how we're responding and how other nation states are responding makes me think your 100-year off estimate of things hitting the fan, it could come earlier, you
It could
know?
come much earlier. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like a high barrier to human movement, mid-range fossil fuel, emission scenario with like lots of national rivalries, trade barriers with tariffs and stuff like that. That is one of the five options that the IPCC models, right? And it is one that leads to there about 3 degrees Celsius warming, which is not as high as it possibly could be, but it is probably the worst for human suffering. So, yeah, I mean, first off, I would say if anybody's really interested in getting more into thinking about migration and how borders work and how different kinds of bordering regimes work, highly recommend Harsha Walia's book, Border and Rule, which is a really, really wonderful survey of bordering regimes all across the Western world. If we're so like in for Europe, for example, Europe is seeing a lot of migration from Africa and from Syria, over the last decade and a half because of the Syrian civil war, which of course itself was triggered in part by a drought, which is triggered by increasing temperatures in the world. And Greece's response to this was one of the original motives for writing my climate book, because I was just thinking a lot about climate migration. Greece handled the influx of Syrian refugees across the Aegean Sea by putting up nets in the Aegean Sea to try to capture or drown migrants, right? We've seen versions of COVID was a really good example of like how states would use ostensible concerns about public health with this virus as an excuse to detain people on boats and just let them die and dehydrate, or tell them to turn back without enough fuel to get back across the sea. In Europe, I think it's important to also understand that there's a lot of animus about like Islam gets racialized in a different way than it does in the US, right? So we can also think of like religion here is often, we don't think of religion as a racial group, but religion definitely gets coded as a racial group. Like the average American will associate Islam with Arabness, even though only like 1 in 5 Muslims in the world is Arab. In Europe,
We aren't known for our religious literacy as a
Right. Well, like
nation.
in Europe, Islam is associated with blackness, right? Like we were often talking about, or at least someone coming from the African continent, whether it's beneath the Sahel or north of it, coming across the Mediterranean Sea, either on the eastern, middle, or western routes. And so, and I do want to be very careful. Like when I talk about the concept of race here, I tend to use the term race instead of ethnicity, because I think that basically, if you think about people groups, nations, races, ethnicities, ethnicity is the term that comes last, and it seems to have an edge taken off of it. There is no such thing as ethnicity that's not ultimately race, and race is not biologically real; it's socially constructed, right? And so like when we talk about different ethnicities, you might as well talk about different racial groups as if they are distinct biological entities that have certain genes or attributes or characteristics, kind of going back to the race pseudosciences of the 19th century and the early 20th century eugenics movement. Yeah, when people see people who are coming into their culture and have different cultural norms than they are used to, they can code that as like an evil threat, right? And so you might feel like you like really detest the fact that some, I don't know, Ethiopian restaurant opened while feeling no problem with the white guy who's your landlord who's about to evict you unless you can like, boost your rents by 20% in a year or something like that, right? Like what gets coded as a problem falls along racial lines. So the person that's actually exploiting you is not a problem, but the person who has no power in society is suddenly the problem, right? And so I don't know quite where to go with that really, but it's race is just an incredibly useful heuristic for navigating like what I am calling here a libidinal economy of desire, right? Like a desire to, we can think like in the simplest level, just to feel strong, to feel like my way of doing things is getting expressed in the world, whether that's my sexual views of women or my racial views of the other, or I might smooth over my and I'm always thinking, I was thinking about this a lot because I've been in Baltimore for the last few years, and it's really struck me how often white people will talk about black culture when what they clearly mean is black people. But it seems to be like much more acceptable to talk about cultural differences rather than racial differences and just put that front and center. I think the term ethnicity does like a similar move, right? It smooths over some of the lack of comfort people have with overtly saying racist things while still talking about racist ideas. And I don't know, like another book, if you're interested in thinking about this, listeners, is Barbara Fields and Karen Fields' book Racecraft, where they kind of say, it's important to understand what we mean by social construct, right? Because the London Underground is a social construct, astrology is a social construct, genocide is a social construct. So what are we talking about? And they kind of say, race is kind of like a social construct of astrology, right? Like it's an imaginary relationship to real things. The planets are up there moving, but the relationship you have between the real thing and what you experience is imaginary. It's not real, right? And then they say the social construct of racism is more akin to the social construct of genocide, right? Deploying actual violence toward a people that you imagine to exist. That has a massive potential for a libidinal economy of desire, especially when mapped on to a political economy of material reality where you are making less money than you should be able to make. You are not able to buy a house the way that your parents did. And you've got to kind of square that by thinking like, oh, this is not the cause of the politicians that I'm voting for in both major political parties. This is because of the, these other people who came in to take our jobs and so forth, right? Yeah.
Recently, the IPCC, kind of gave a better outlook on the earlier kind of 4-degree prediction. And they're like, it might be like 2.1 to 3.4. And there was a question about both how, since our last conversation about your recent book on the end of denial, like how has the slight reduction in the projected warnings from climate science changed or reshaped the predicament from your perspective?
And not a whole lot, honestly. I want to be optimistic about that little drop. So yeah, so if people don't know, like, so the IPCC 6 assessment report 6 that came out in 21 and 22 projected a model average of 3.2 degrees warming. Recent policy analysts will often put it as low as something like, I think the lowest I've seen is like 2.4, usually something closer to 2.7 degrees warming. The reason for that is like the IPCC is already outdated by the time it comes out because they work on 7 or 8 year cycles and they're taking model runs from that whole time, right? So if you're gathering data within an 8-year time frame and averaging that data together, then that means by the end of that 8-year time frame when you publish the report, your models are already telling you something that's hotter than it's going to be in 21 when the published report comes out, right? So the moment that the IPCC report is published, it has already been outdated for several years, right? So that it is hopeful if we can. It's important for people to understand. Every 10th of a degree warming means the death of additional tens of millions of people. And the higher we go, it starts to get into the hundreds of millions per 10th degree warming, right? So I would love to believe that we could limit warming to something like crazy low, like 2.5. I still kind of think that we go up to 3 degrees by end of century. And I am not there saying that I think the energy modelers are wrong. I just want to note that what they model when we're talking about projections is exclusively related to stated policies and current energy systems, right? Which is so like they're not actually predicting the future. My example that I always go to is if Biden passes,
if we do what we say we're going to do.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, not even completely. I mean, one way to think of it is like if Biden does the biggest climate legislation that ever happened in the Inflation Reduction Act in the summer of 22, that helps lower our projected, like on like climatetracker.com, that's going to lower the policy program apparatus that they're computing into their program here. If, however, like a year later, Biden starts off his campaign for reelection, one by turning on student loans, and then 2 weeks later giving full-throated support to historic genocide, the likes of which are almost without comparison, right? I mean, like there are definitely worse genocides. The Nazis definitely killed a higher rate of people than the Israelis have in Gaza. But for a point of comparison here, right, which is problematic and controversial here, but if the Nazis killed north of 6 million people over a period of 3.5 years, then we're talking somewhere in the nature of 17 or 20% of the population, of the Jewish population in Europe per year on average, right? And it happened in very concentrated phases where you have 1.5 million killed within 100 days in 42. So it's not completely accurate to think about averages, but like in Gaza, we're still talking about the liquidation of a population on the order of 10 to 12%, right? It's not as fast as what the Nazis were doing, but it's not that. It is incredible pace of life, right? So a lot of people had a big problem with that, right? And I'm not super privy on the internal discussions of Hamas, but those who are that I've listened to talk about it, we're saying like they'd had a lot of success in the past with hostage exchanges. You can get like 100 to 1 or even 1,000 to 1 Israelis to Palestinians in hostage exchanges. They didn't have a reason to think that Biden would do something that no other American president has ever done, which is to allow this amount of destruction. It wasn't unreasonable to think that Israel would basically bombard them for a few weeks and then stop, because they stop when the American president says stop. That's the relationship going back to 1967. So, like, what I'm trying to kind of spell out there is you get this unprecedented genocide that starts off campaign election season, and now we have fire truck going by here. I don't know if you can hear that. That starts off campaign election season and risk depressing turnout and throwing an election to Trump again, right? And many of us were saying this all along. Like many people around Harris were also saying this. You really got to turn the tide here and distance yourself from Biden if you want to have a shot. And then now we know that like among people who were Biden voters in 2020 who were not 2024 voting for Harris, about a third of them say it was specifically because of the Gaza genocide that her administration was running or arming, right, and authorizing and not trying to stop. And so what I want to say is, like, when we're thinking climate policy emission scenarios, it does not take into account whether an American president is going to turn on student loans and piss off its, educated, affluent voters. It does not take into account whether or not an American president is going to authorize a genocide and depress turnout and throw an election that they should have easily won. It's just modeling energy systems and climate policy, right? I have a lot of respect for what climate modelers do. They have a lot of expertise that I cannot imagine doing. They will also tell you these are not crystal balls. They are not predicting the path that we are on. They are depicting the energy and policy path that we are on alone without any consideration to the broader political context, because you really just can't model all of the rest of that, right? So it's a tool that we should take with some caution.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder if you think there's an analogy between the role oil acquisition plays in the kind of trinity of perversion, democracy, and what AI is generating in the present. Because the kind of assumed assumption that the preservation of Western dominance entails winning an AI race and therefore legitimating, not very little regulation and boundaries on research and development, impact on the larger economy, the outsourcing of so much of it to, impoverished wages in the global South, to the huge volume of energy use that's taking place and generating the models and ongoing use of them. There seems to be especially with this administration having the, right behind your swearing in, a bunch of billionaires who are, winning this race, this connection between kind of peak data acquisition, the military industrial complex, and preserving the center of kind of Western power globally.
Yeah. There was a report the other day that came out that said GDP growth in the U.S. would have been well under 1% if not for AI in the last year, which piqued my ears as someone who reads a lot of climate modeling, because like the nightmare scenario without fossil fuel inputs is that we collapse beneath 1% GDP growth per year, under which conditions like capitalism is basically impossible. So one way to think about AI is like the laundering of severely bloated assets into a market, which I think probably the people running the AI game understand is a big bubble. I think it's becoming like recently, all of a sudden in the last few weeks, it's become more common to see news reports talk about it as a bubble, which it seems to have been like always, I guess, to me, at least since ChatGPT came online. But look, I'm very AI skeptical. I think it's a bubble, and it's going to be enormously socially consequential when it pops, and a lot of that investment stops, and a lot of businesses stop operating in the way that they have before. Our friend Kester Bruin wrote a really great book on this, AI called Godlike, if anyone's interested in thinking about this more. What I see as an educator is that there is a sharp, like immensely sharp decline in students' ability to not just write and even read, but even it seems to have messed with the simple like principle of non-contradiction. A is not A seems to not be working in the same way that it did before 2022 when ChatGPT came online. So I'm interested in, as an educator, as someone who would like people to continue reading books and having thoughts in the world and writing about those thoughts. But my sense is that, I mean, at the end of the day, AI is like any other technological innovation that a capitalist throws into production. The reason you throw in technological innovation into a production chain is so that you can boost the amount of value produced by a given average laborer in that value chain, right? And AI can do that by letting you fire workers, and you have an inferior product being done by a smaller number of people, right? That the buyers will still purchase, right? So it's a way to change the organic composition of capital, as Marx would say, to put more into the constant capital and reduce the variable capital, put more into the means of production, and cut labor costs, right? When that bubble pops and it becomes clear that AI can't deliver on the promises that it's being given. I guess I should also say I'm very skeptical that we ever actually get anything like AI. Everyone talks about AI as if it's already here. Nobody meant, outside of very small niche communities, nobody meant large language models until 2022. When people said AI, they were usually envisioning like a self-sentient robot. I don't know that we ever get something like what people meant by AI before 3 years ago. But what I do know is that like when the bubble pops, I think the hope among Altman and the Musk and all the rest of them is that there will be enough apparatus capture in the U.S. that they can control with surveillance and means of distribution networks and so forth, that even if, I don't know, if you say you got 90% of the population using AI and then the bubble pops and all of a sudden only 20% of the workers are actually using that in their jobs anymore, like they want to be the guys that are holding the bag for that 20%, right? On the other hand, there are certain things that AI can do like really well that are basically tasks that you do at an email job. They can create like a schedule for you. If they can run a schedule for you, they can also tell you like how to best liquidate an entire people group by administering a starvation. It's not clear to me why you need AI for that, because it turns off, you can also, early in the Trump administration, they were using AI to, decide what to cut from Doge, various agencies. It's not clear to me why you need to know that if you're trying to cut spending and kill as many people as possible, because they can also just turn off USAID, which also have some reason to be skeptical of with CIA connections and all of that. But you cut off USAID, and then the Lancet published a report over the summer that says this is going to kill 14 million people over the next 5 years. It is the largest planned conscious mass killing that has ever happened in human history. Just by simply turning off aid from an organization from like vaccinating. In 4.5 million of those deaths are going to be children under the age of 5, right? So like the AI dream is also about like planning controls of people groups, surveillance, deciding who gets to get resources and who does not. And then of course, again, like one of the dreams is military technology. How can you have automated killbots that can make their own decisions, and so that we can, have in a classic kind of Zizekian joke, robots instead of dating other robots so that we can have conversations. It's, with our romantic partners, it's robots killing other robots and then splattering a bunch of people in the process, right? That to me is like the kind of the horrifying nightmare scenario. But yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how that intersects with GDP growth and investment as we try to figure out ways to immiserate more of the population and reduce them to poverty. And then it can help us deal with those people in poverty by figuring out how to cut their food until they just die off and disappear.
Yeah, the energy side of it the energy use of data centers is making the you could if we stay on oil as the primary energy source, is going to create a whole host of problems. Like
Yeah.
in
Well,
in
it
just
won't
like
run
the
on oil.
last
It runs on natural gas and coal, right?
yeah
Primarily, it's driving like a renaissance in natural gas because oil is not oil. Yeah, primary energy input, but it's not the electricity. Like 1 or 2% of electricity is oil. Yeah, it's a reason to turn the methane back on, which
mhm,
is. Yeah, if you don't know, by the way, people listening, natural gas is methane, right? It's kind of like when mayonnaise rebranded into aioli, right?
yeah
It's a really nice rebrand, but it's just methane. It's the gas that's 60 or 80 times worse than carbon dioxide on a short time scale.
hmm Kester and I did a series last at the end of last year on
Hmm.
AI, and inspired by his book and stuff. And one of the economists that we talked to said, but by the end of the year last year, a whole percent of the power used globally was AI data centers, and
Mm.
by 2030, it will be between 3 and 4%
Hmm.
of just like the amount of power being used. We're already getting like skyrocketing prices of near data centers, right? Where people are now organizing to resist data centers being nearby because they get access to the normal power thing. It raises the cost for everybody,
Yeah.
and this kind of thing. And the amount of energy and water that they're using is rather significant.
Yeah,
And
actually, I always get frustrated that I wasn't able to talk about it in my climate book because in Future of Denial, it came out in 2024.
yeah,
And the only places I talk about AI are in military systems or border technologies. But the reason is because a book that came out in 2024, I had to turn in the manuscript in the summer of 22, and ChatGPT came online in the fall of 22, right? So like the big craze had not happened
yeah.
yet,
You
and it just
haven't
feels
put your
maddening
book
how
in and asked
fast.
it what you'd think. Have
Yeah,
you
like
put your
I get
book
asked.
in and then ask Claude what would I think about
Oh
the
yeah, no,
the connection of AI
I
to the climate
occasionally
crisis?
have Google inflict. If I'm searching something related to what I do, yeah, it'll spit it. It's very clear that it's been trained on some of the stuff that I do, but I try to stay away from that. I don't need a robot that gets 40% of the stuff that I know wrong, right? I try to not use it as much as possible, but yeah, so. But sorry, I
Yeah.
interrupted. You were in the middle of a thought
Oh no,
there.
no, no. I was just meaning the. It was really about that shift. When you wrote the book to when it came out.
Mm.
All of a sudden there's now an unquestioning allegiance to winning a race to have access to a technology that is with a extremely high energy demand and growing
And no clear
ravenously.
path on becoming profitable, right? Like, I mean, that's the
Yeah.
other. It's the interesting
Well,
thing
who
from
needs
like a.
that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean that's it's interesting to think through like what the Marxist law of accumulation says about an industry that cannot be profitable. And again, like there are still avenues that I can see for like how something that's not profitable now allows you to garner enough of certain types of markets that when it collapses will allow you to become profitable, perhaps. But right now, I mean, this is like one of the big problems. It's just there's like all of the money coming into AI is coming in through investment or other payments from other AI companies, right? Like it's a big circle that's generating a lot of financial activity, but it's not delivering like actual profits at any sector. So.
Yeah, yeah. Just the idea that a company makes money by selling future access to its data and the use of tools that will allow you to create with it. And then the company that sold it then purchases futures in the company they just sold it from. And
Right.
then their valuation collectively snowballs while zero work has been done, and the futures that are reciprocating the investment into each other are guesses at best at this point. And that's why our market isn't currently tanking.
Right.
It's
No,
it's
I
kind
mean,
of
like,
wild.
but like to say it seriously, though, I mean, I think it's one way to think about the secular decline in the rate of profit in industrial sectors, right? This is something Marx told us would happen forever ago, and it appears to be at least broadly correct that over time in the actual producing part of the economy, as the organic composition of capital changes, you get like a decline in the rate of profit. However, that is not true whatsoever for the financial system, right? So something that Marx did not have access to is the whole concept of how seigniorage and money creation through central banks would work. And so if you pump in a bunch of liquidity through central banks, where, I mean, it's a fairly sophisticated process, but it's more or less just kind of changing the numbers on a balance sheet at the Federal Reserve, which you can't do. You can't go to your bank and say, I need more liquidity. Can you change $100 into $100,000, right? But other banks can do that through like the trading of bonds and treasury notes and stuff like that. So again, it's a little more complicated than that. But one way to think about AI is if there's no place to put the investments, we've got all this like fossil fuel money, like we're pulling in all these like derivatives from, financial swaps and so forth. Like, where do you put all of that money, especially if you're like Saudi Arabia or something, and you're kind of looking at a future where we might have to stop pumping out the oil? One way to do that is to pump that money into AI and hope for the best as part of your increasingly diversifying portfolio that used to be oil money but now needs to be other things, hoping that something isn't collapsing by the end of it.
So one other question, the democratic ideal or liberalism as an experiment of sorts, it assumes a certain kind of subject with freedoms, obligations to each other, social contract. But when the liberal subject is engaging in democracy, there's an assumption of kind of rationality, freedom to reflect on it, and then a shared commitment to some kind of deliberative process, right? Where the collective project is of a more significant import than one's own political stakes in it, right? And that kind of thing is being undermined in lots of areas, that we've talked about, like in the economic sphere or in the claim for political power and attraction of authoritarianism. But I wonder how you think the larger psychoanalytic tradition is reflecting on the subject as an increasing number of our relations and what we see of the other and interact with are kind of, algorithmically filtered to generate antagonism, experiencing deep deficits or needs. Like, so much of our kind of precognitive reflection about the world is what an algorithm learns to go to us, right? In some sense, in the ideal state, right, the Athenians, the goal would be as many of them as possible to get there to deliberate and reflect and figure out what's best. Now there's not even like the public square gets smaller into lots of little bitty tribes, all the way down to just you, right? Like there's your experience of your neighbor. 80% of our interactions on average for Americans are interactions where one of the major social media companies is deciding what of even your friends and family to show you. Right. And then when you see the impact in the last few elections of algorithms and the purchasing of the algorithms, right? Like we don't need China showing what's going on in Palestine on TikTok, but maybe a billionaire who donated $250,000 to Trump. So when we adopt technologies that shape our subjectivity in this new way and aren't reflecting about it, are there particular fears or possibilities that you think the psychoanalytic tradition can help us reflect on?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very Deleuzian desiring machine type question. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like desire is always desire of the other. We have certain desires as being like animals, but those desires are always curated, enhanced, maintained, negotiated through our existence as being speaking beings in relation to other speaking beings, right? So you have like a desire for food or sex or sleep or whatever else as an animal, but like the particular food that you want, do you want a burger or do you want sushi is very much indicative of like you as a desiring being in relation to other desiring beings who have told you what to desire. Social media, like one of the places that my mind goes on that is it's very interesting that there's this whole like growing culture of Zoomer influencers or people trying to be influencers, which has everything to do with trying to be someone who can foster the desire of the other, right? To, portray myself as somebody who can go and live in a van and be carefree or have a farm or not wear very many clothes or like whatever else it may be, right? And so all of that is like, it's a desiring apparatus, right? It's like, it's a projection of, I'm going to lie to you. I'm going to pretend like my life is a different thing than it actually is in order to foster myself as an object of desire for you so that I can like mediate, ad money for some company. And yeah, it's interesting that like the algorithm kind of works as the big other, like in Lacanian thought, right? Like the small others that you desire come out of the field of the big other, right? And in a very real sense, we could think of the like social media as being like the big other algorithm that's kind of like shooting like little small other. Would you like to desire this to or that today, right? I've heard once recently heard someone kind of describe it as for a lot of young men, for example, like what the social media apparatus gives you to every single day is like the options of today. Would you like to desire to be horny or be a fascist, right? Like you can be horny or you can be a Nazi. But like it's giving you those two options of which thing would you like to desire today, right? And I don't know where that goes. It seems to be something about identity creation. It's being mediated through actual human beings, although not always now, because now we have AI influencers and all of that as well. But for the moment, it's largely driven by people who have correctly ascertained, I would argue, that to be a successful professional person in whatever capacity means lying to each other, right? So like the Zoomer influencer on Instagram is doing a similar thing that the person on LinkedIn does when they say, I'm so pleased to announce that I've been promoted to head of this irrelevant department at this job that I never wanted to do when I was a kid, right? Neither of them are actually happy about this situation, but they have to perform a certain happiness in order to get the adoration of the other, and so as to portray themselves as successful, or if you're an influencer, get the ad money and so forth, right? I don't know where that goes long term. I really don't. I find it very troubling that we, at every level of our culture, seem to prioritize lying. And if you really want to make money, you need to be really good at lying and deceiving people. I think that we should stigmatize lying. And I don't know, to bring it back to Plato, give everyone a little sense of shame. It always feels weird to like advocate for shame, especially as someone who like grew up in like a purity culture, right? As I'm sure many of your listeners like will be familiar with. But it does seem to be like there's something about having shame. I mean, this is why the tyrant is so
and
impressive.
Shame about the right things.
Shame about the right thing. I mean, because what you get otherwise is you get anxiety, like the frantic anxiety of trying to occupy yourself with the visions that you're actually good or that you're doing something meaningful. Like what the tyrant taps into is people's people will feel impressed that he has no working sense of shame, right? I think we should bring back a little bit of shame at lying to people, abusing people, making people's lives worse, shilling for some company, working for some scam. Just too many things are lies and scams at this point. We need to bring back a little bit of shame on lying.
Yeah. I had a similar thought a couple months ago, right when you get the insistence on covering up Epstein stuff and not releasing things from Republicans, and this is like it seemed like Obama told the rest of the Democrats you're allowed to talk about Gaza now, and I was at the Cigar Lounge, which is a real easy way to talk to people across all sorts of different diversities in the South, and you had the more Democrat or progressive people in the room, like sitting there going like, how am I supposed to believe? Why would I trust you for anything if you just can't identify a genocide? Like, how effed up are you? This is ridiculous. Like, you've been obfuscating for over a year, and now you finally have permission to be like, wow, some human rights are being violated. And then the Republicans are saying the same. You ran on releasing all the files. You're covering up for a giant pedo. And how effed up is this? And it was sitting there, and like the topic is different, right? But for both of them, it's like, why would we trust our parties when they just have no interest in even like feigning care for kids, be it starving kids in Palestine or, all the cover-ups of pedophilia. And I think that group of people, they all get along because you all hang out and your family probably rolls their eyes because you smell bad regularly. But it was like there was sudden solidarity in a way that kind of found solidarity that shouldn't they have just enough shame? Like you shouldn't be able to run on X and then not release it, or to like you say like you're the humanitarian and you would hate to have some tyrant running the military, and then you're like, but I mean defensive weapons.
Only the offensive weapon, the war weapon. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I might be a little cynical on this, but I actually think that
cynical?
Like, the
Can't believe
thing that Trump could really do to boost his image as an honest person would just be come out and fully say, Yeah, of course I molested underage girls. Who among us, let him who has never done this cast the first stone. I feel like, I mean, this is based kind of on my experience of like how very conservative religious communities deal with ministers who are found to be having these criminal, like abuse cases. Right? But I just don't think it would be that big of a deal, and I think that there's a certain figure out there. I am frightened to speculate about how much of the population this would be, but there was a certain figure that if he just came out and said, of course I did it, they would respect him more for doing that, right? So hopefully he doesn't do that, but right. But.
Yeah. Well, if that's not a cheery note to wrap up on.
Yeah. Well, it's been good. It's always great to be back. Thanks for inviting me on. And like I said, like it was really great to get a chance to kind of tie some ideas together for that essay that ended up putting out on my podcast as well, and got some good response. So yeah, so it's really good. It's great to talk to you about always.
Yeah. Well, we didn't even get to the question. There's a very long question about wanting Tad to talk about Peter Thiel.
Oh my God! I could have gone on a 20-minute rant there. Oh man! If anybody has not watched or listened to the interview he did with Russ Dout that gets into all his theology, hedges on the question of whether humans should continue to exist, well worth your time. Really wonderful.
You didn't listen to it and say, I'm so glad this guy is pulling major dials for the future flourishing of our species.
It's interesting to see how a billionaire doesn't understand basics of like how money or power works. It was really interesting. But yeah, no, we can't go into that now because that would get me off. We also didn't talk any theology, plenty more areas that we could have, but it was wonderful to kind of get into that. So thanks a lot, Trip.
All right. Well, next time, Palantir Special.
Okay. All right. Deal. Yeah, let's do it.
Like if you thought the Holy Ghost was watching you all the time, just wait till Palantir does.
Yeah.